Right, there we go. So folks, welcome to Toronto Workshop. Our guest today is Sasha Issenberg. Sasha is a journalist and the author of 5 books, including most recently The Lie Detectives, in search of a playbook for winning elections in a disinformation age. He teaches at the UCLA Department of Political Science and is a correspondent for Monocle. His work has appeared in New York, the New York Times Magazine, and George, where he was a contributing editor. In 2012, he published The Victory Lab, The Secret Science of Winning Campaigns, which, in my opinion, is one of the best 5 books on modern American politics. And as I mentioned, his new book, The Lie Detectives, In Search of a Playbook for Winning Elections in a Disinformation Age, is recently published earlier this year, and I highly recommend it. The plan is that Sasha and I will have a discussion initially, and then we'll open it out to the audience. As I said, I'd like this to be a very organic sort of conversation. So please, if you're in the audience and you have a question as we're going through, please feel free to raise your hand and I'll call on you throughout the conversation. But Sasha, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Professor. It's good to be here.
So let's just start with an easy one. This is your 5th book, and in the acknowledgements of this one, you promise your daughter that you will write another one, so you're not done yet. So in the digital age, why do you write books?
Because I'm sort of I'm a magazine writer, probably definitely by temperament and the sort of formative experiences of my journalism career. And occasionally I like magazine writing more than I like being a newspaper reporter, because I like the idea of being able to throw myself into a new world for maybe a month or 2 months to tell a story at some more length. And it turns out occasionally that there are things that I want to spend more than a couple months on. And books are a way to get deeper into a sphere, both in the sort of research and reporting and in the writing and sort of thinking about how you construct a narrative. I should note that my books are wildly varied in length. So this one is pretty short. It's about 10% of the length of the one I wrote previously, which was a history of the battles over same-sex marriage that I spent a decade on. So, but yeah, I like the idea of being able to sort of immerse myself in a new world and sort of understand it at a length that often daily, weekly, monthly journalism doesn't permit.
And other than your own, and again, Sasha's latest book is The Lie Detectives, and I'd highly recommend it. Other than your own, what are some of the best books that you've read recently?
Let's see. I have been reading a bunch of histories of the Olympics for what might be my next book project. Some of them have been good and some of them haven't been particularly good, but I've been enjoying. David Goldblatt wrote a history of the Olympics, a sort of politically minded history of the Olympics that I liked. I'm reading Palestine 1936 at the moment, sort of just drawn by obvious regional interests there, and I knew a bit about the founding of Israel. I knew a bit about the period around the Balfour Declaration, the end of the Ottoman Empire, and I knew very little about what was going on in the interim. And it's a pretty good narrative history that develops a cast of characters pretty engagingly. So that's the other one I would point out.
Thank you. So if we turn back a little bit, so who identified your talent for storytelling? How did you get into this?
In retrospect, I had as a kid always sort of been drawn to the news, and I was interested in politics from a young age. As a nerdy kid from like age 5 or 6, I was really into baseball, and then at some point around like age 11 or 12, the part of my brain that was sort of obsessive about had been obsessive about like memorizing lineups and batting averages became obsessive about memorizing senators and how many terms they'd been in office and what committees they were on, type thing. And I guess I would have thought that my interest was in politics, which obviously it is, but and that media was the vehicle to get there. But I had the chance to become an intern at a magazine in while I was in high school, growing up in New York, and I realized that I don't think I'd been that maybe I was, not just interested in as a consumer of media, but was I love the culture of a magazine. The I found like magazine editorial meetings as a 15-year-old, 16-year-old who's able to sit in on them, just like these wonderful things where people got to sit around for a few hours and over a catered sandwich tray and take things that were sort of in the news and think about how you could tell a bigger story behind them. And there was this real great creative ambition that flowed through there, where what's a fresh angle we can take on this, what's part of the story hasn't been told before, who would be the perfect match of writer and subject. And I found that to be this sort of wonderland. And I've done a lot of different things under the umbrella of journalism in the almost 30 years since then, but pretty much everything I've done has been in some form or another journalism.
Excellent. So moving forward to 2012, so you publish The Victory Lab, The Secret Science of Winning Campaigns. And in my reading of The Victory Lab and The Lie Detectives, they can very much be read as sort of a part one, part two sort of idea. They're very much a continuation of a theme. For those who haven't read Victory Lab, could you just provide a quick synopsis and then perhaps turn to the core thesis that you see as connecting the two?
Sure. So it's basically an account of a scientific revolution that took place within political campaigns in the first decade of this century. And just for the sake of this whole discussion, we'll talk mostly about US. My default is to be talking about US politics, but I think a lot of this is relevant to stuff in other countries, and the questions I'm very happy to do as best I can to try to stitch what's relevant here to the Canadian experience or elsewhere. But there are some aspects of this that are sort of unique or specific to the American case. But there were these two particular sort of strands of innovation that took place during that decade. One was all the data that had become available to people inside electoral politics, the parties, consultants, operatives running races, that allowed them to profile voters at the individual level. The basic big shift, conceptual shift here, was from campaigns having to triage the electorate at a geographic level, some combination of precincts, which tend to be the smallest unit of sort of measure, it's a polling place basically, of measurable vote outcomes, or the census tract, our version of StatsCan, neighborhood data basically, where that's. So if you were in the 1990s, you either had to split the electorate into these zones, because that was the smallest unit at which you could actually learn something meaningful, or in sort of broad categories. And I have to apologize if you're hearing anything. I have some construction going on
It's
in
all
our
good.
house. Okay. Or the sort of large geographic categories that we typically see on polls: women, voters aged 18 to 40, African Americans, whatever the categories are, because those were the things that were represented on voter registration records, and that which had been computerized basically in a very primitive way in the 1960s. Because of a bunch of developments which are boring to most people and might not be to you, changes in database architecture and computing power, and it became possible by the late 1990s to begin to, one, create national databases of all these localized voter registration records, and two, to be able to link them to the much larger repositories of data on individuals that were held by consumer marketers. First developed by banks in the 1950s to inform credit rating, credit scores, and then being used by direct mail marketers and the like. And so by the late 90s, it became possible to stitch together Sasha Issenberg, the voter on whom you maybe had a couple dozen data points based on when I registered and if I voted in a given election, and if I signed up to vote by mail, and my age and gender and all that stuff, with the fact that there was a private sector data warehouse that, knew that I likely bought a washer dryer in the last 6 months, and that I subscribed to Sports Illustrated magazine, and that I had signed up for a luxury vacation catalog and all these various things. And so when by roughly 2000, those sort of what had been these very distinct pools of data had merged, and statistical modeling techniques made it possible to do very basic predictive modeling, first often kind of cluster type stuff, segment analysis, and later individual level predictive modeling on voters' likelihoods of casting a ballot and of voting for one candidate or the other. And so we tend to group these sort of developments together as micro-targeting tends to be the catch-all phrase, but you basically, over the course of that decade, have this go from unknown in American politics, thinking of individuals as individual people as the core targetable unit of political communication, to it becoming by 2012, when my book comes out, something that is widespread, not just for well-funded presidential campaigns, but for people running for county executive or state legislature or something. So that's one of the innovation threads I cover. And then the other is the use of randomized experiments. I saw Lee-Moore, is that your name? You're at ISPS at Yale,
Yes.
which I think the bureaucratic framework might have changed somehow, but has been a hub for some of the sort of foundational work in this area. Basically in 1998, a couple of political scientists at Yale went out and did this thing, which at the time was pretty radical within the field, which is to go out and do a randomized control trial, a real world field experiment to measure at that point the relative effectiveness of a door knock, a direct postcard, and a phone call with a get out the vote reminder, and then measure the relative effectiveness of each, and then had a control sample and measure the relative effectiveness of each method on increasing people's likelihood of voting. And it turns out that the door knock was really effective. The phone call did nothing. And it launched what turned into, a major subfield of academic political science, but a real interest of political practitioners in the US to be out doing these field experiments to really, for the first time, develop a base of empirical knowledge about what worked and what didn't, and by extension, how to incorporate the tactics and think about how to spend money most effectively. And again, you go by 2000, really there being nothing better than folk wisdom to say, is a television ad better than a piece of direct mail to change somebody's opinion on an issue, to by 2010 there being a robust body of knowledge, at least in certain corners of campaigning, that help campaigns create, lean on a really sophisticated hierarchy of what the most effective methods for various types of political contact are. So anyway, so these two threads of political innovation that together I sort of described as the scientific revolution in campaigns. I write this book in 2012. A few things that are I was aware of in retrospect, but are really clear now 12 years later. Like, the book barely mentions the internet.
Yeah.
And one reason for that is that a lot of the data that I was just talking about, and that was important to the characters I was writing about in the book, was tethered to voter registration information, which were people, use your real name at your home address, and it's tethered to a real world identity. And all the experiments were based off of that data set. And so we had a very clear idea of the most effective types of direct mail, which go to your actual real world mailbox, the most effective ways for volunteers to have an interaction at the doorstep, all again tethered to real world activity. And very little of that data was easily linked, or it was very difficult to link what was a whole sort of architecture of knowledge that was tied to these real world interactions and real world locations to people's presence on the internet. And so, um, uh, so the book really didn't deal with the internet. And in the years since, and I should say, and it's a pretty positive, optimistic book about the use of technology, and we could debate how many of these things are actual technology, as opposed to just like smart people. I mean, I don't know if randomized experiments are technology. They need computers to do, but everything needs computers to do. But anyway, it was about innovation. It was a largely positive, optimistic story about innovation in politics, because a lot of the institutions that I was writing about in the book exist either in parts of our tax code, largely exist in parts of our tax code where their purpose is to get better at registering and mobilizing voters. And the best, as it happens, for methodological reasons, like the best experiments were the ones that could measure where the dependent variable you were measuring was propensity to vote or propensity to register. And so the people I was writing about in this book were using these new techniques and tools and data for what seemed, I didn't use the term at the time because we didn't feel like we were in a crisis over democracy in the United States, but were largely pro-democratic activities, giving people, making people, increasing the likelihood of an individual who is unregistered to register, increasing the likelihood of somebody who's already registered but didn't regularly vote to cast a ballot, and tailoring the information that you were giving voters so that it was more closely identified with what you expected were the things that they cared about. Those seem like good developments for just broadly for sort of the civic climate in the United States. And I don't think it was a coincidence that voter participation through turnout rates hit a low in 1996, historic low, basically through most of the 20th century. Voter participation has been on some version of a decline, and that it has been pretty high over the last couple of decades, and there are a lot of different theories we can share for that. But I don't think it's a coincidence that this is during a time when campaigns got better about being efficient in doing the work of turning out voters. And so I've had to reckon for the last decade with like one, like the question of whether whether I had been naive in sort of the way that I thought about the role of innovation in campaigns. And and I'll leave it on this, and you could pick it up and go in whichever direction you want, Rohan. But like I start the book with an anecdote from 2016 when this really crystallized for me. I was in San Antonio, Texas, with a colleague of mine at the time I was writing for Bloomberg for Business Week. And my colleague Josh Green and I went and spent some part of a week with the Trump digital team we ended up doing a pair of stories in Business Week about this. And we quoted a senior campaign official who was talking about the three major voter suppression efforts that they had underway. And the person showed us some videos that they were targeting to sort of young, idealistic, progressive voters and African Americans and Latinos, and what they claimed was sort of certain parts of South Florida, and were explaining how they were using Facebook dark posts to target these with the goal of driving these people away from voting. Right? These are people who, if they voted, would probably vote for Hillary Clinton. Trump would be happy if they just didn't vote at all. Mm-hmm. And the goal of this communication, as the campaign official sort of explained it to us, was not to get them to give them information to get them to change their opinion. It was to take these people who might be on the cusp of participating in the political process and disillusion them enough to not want to cast a ballot altogether. And it was the first time for me that I had encountered, after, at this point, 6-7 years of reporting on a sort of sphere of people who I thought were on the cutting edge of thinking about technology and innovation in politics. I'd heard somebody speak the language of sort of the modern high-tech advanced campaign with the goal of doing something that could be described as anti-democratic. And that was really the moment for me that I really had to rethink, had I missed something, had something fundamentally changed in the nature of the technology that was available to campaigns. And over the years since, 8 years later, I think this question of disinformation, which is a catch-all term we can get into if you want, has floated above almost everything that's happened in American politics and certainly in a number of our peer countries as well. And at some point, I was struck after 2020 that it might be time to sort of go back to a similar sphere of figures and think about this sort of how they thought about communicating and measuring the effectiveness of communication in this new era.
Yeah. Just as a reminder, if anyone has any questions or wants to follow up on anything, please feel free to raise your hand and I'll call on you throughout. It's very much meant to be a discussion, including of the audience. But as you mentioned, in the Victory Lab, you certainly mentioned the internet, but it's not a focus. And a core part of your thesis in Lie Detectives, as far as I read it, was that the decentralization of platforms has enabled sort of disinformation. But again, similarly, you don't really focus too much on AI or LLMs or those sorts of things. Can you talk us through the role of sort of technology and campaigns and how that's changed?
Yeah. So I think the mentality of the folks who make decisions about campaigns in the United States, certainly up until up until 2016 is sort of the hinge moment. I mean, for so many things, but it's kind of the hinge moment, I think, for this, when there's, after 2016, they're all obviously in the United States, people have all sorts of questions about how did Trump win. And one line of inquiry focuses on all the things that were happening on the internet that nobody really pieced together over the course of the year. And I think it was the start of a reckoning. Obviously, we've been talking about the campaigns using the internet to raise money, and we were talking about Obama using YouTube and Facebook in 2008. So it wasn't like people discovered the internet in 2016. I think in 2016, what happened was that people recognized that there was just a fundamentally different mode of communication online that challenged a lot of the underlying assumptions about the dynamics of political communication, almost all of which were tied to this unique set of circumstances that, in retrospect, it's clear this sort of unique set of circumstances of mid to late 20th century America that one, the centralization of media in 3 broadcast television networks, a couple of big city newspapers, a couple of newspapers in each big city or region, a handful of national news magazines, basically probably 90% of the political communication in this country for from, we'll say, 1960 to 2000 to 2010 was happening through like 11 vectors of communication in this country, right? And campaigns were focused on controlling those. They did not have to think a lot about word of mouth, which existed obviously, but and it created this, I think, delusion of omniscience on the part of political consultants that they could see everything that was reaching a voter and could try to control it, right? So you could buy advertising inventory in all of these places. You could do your part to try to control how these newspapers and magazines and TV networks covered your candidate. And so that centralization was it turns out, a unique circumstance of a set of economics and technological mechanisms that sort of existed for a few decades. All of those institutions I just talked about were all attached themselves to some idea of neutrality, that made it possible for campaign operatives to sort of appeal to them as agents of accountability for truth and falsehood. And the 19th century was filled with a lot of partisan newspapers in the United States that very overtly favored one candidate or party over the other, as is the case in every European country. And Canada is probably closer to the U.S. example in my understanding of Canadian media history. But in most places around the world, newspapers serve as adjuncts of political movements or parties. Anyway, so there were these sort of unique circumstances in the United States that existed that no longer exist in our current digital environment. But so much of the logic of how you run a campaign was tied to these circumstances in which multiple generations of political operatives, all the name brand American political operatives you can think of, David Axelrod, Karl Rove, all these people were shaped by this world of 1970s, 80s, 90s American media. And every sort of rule of thumb they have about how you choose to communicate, when you respond to an attack from your opponent, are all predicated on the assumptions attached to this dynamic. And so what is fundamentally happening now, and disinformation is kind of the useful catch-all, I think, for it, but fundamentally, my book is about a political class reckoning with the anxieties created by realizing that they not just don't control the means of communication to reach voters now, but that they can't even have full visibility into what is reaching voters now. And it's about people trying to navigate that new media environment up against what stands to be a pretty pernicious threat, which is people very purposefully and overtly using it for ill, to mislead, confuse voters.
Thank you. Saren.
Hi, Sasha. Thanks for sharing the communication aspect. Do you also think that the way that redistricting has been sequentially being more and more clustered around people who share very similar life experiences, beliefs, and second, the fact that there was also racial animus due to the Obama administration being in office that also contributed to this growing gap in ideology. And sure, all these different vectors that you cited probably exacerbated that more. But do you feel like those, what I just shared, are fundamental to?
Oh yeah. And I'm by no means somebody who and I'm by no means somebody who thinks social media caused people to lie. I mean, like, people have all sorts of motives for being bad to other people online. I think you're right that there are a number of political motivations for them. I mean, you touch on a few major trends in American politics over 30 to 50 years, right? I mean, our parties have become more polarized. The parties have become more ideologically sorted. So they're actually, our Republican Party is a very consistently conservative party. Our Democratic Party is a very consistently liberal party. That was not true 40 years ago.
Well, it's also, I mean, I would argue the Republican Party has gravitated to become a lot more nativist and nationalistic. And
sure, no, absolutely. Yeah. But but the Republican Party in the 1980s was filled with people of varying views on immigration, for example, and the Democratic Party feels very, and now they've sorted so that one is fundamentally an anti-immigration party and one's a fundamentally pro-immigration party, and you know, I think the way that our districts are drawn, I think the way that people are able to self-segregate by location and probably by media consumption, all these things are contributing to the various pathologies of our politics in different ways. What I think has happened, the big change here was that it was very difficult. This is the people who could communicate with a large number of voters at one time. If you go back, I'll pick 1980 as arbitrary time before the internet, but this is true of basically, I think, any period between 1950, 60 and 2010. If you go, the people who could reach a large number, look, anybody could say stuff to their neighbors, their schoolmates, the people at the office, maybe a slightly larger number of people at a hockey match or a bar or a farmer's market or whatever. But to reach a real large number of people, you know, in a country of now 350 million, but, you know, still large fractions of that in 250 million in the 80s, whatever. To reach large numbers, the types of numbers that you have to reach to swing an election, not just for president, but for mayor, you needed either an established political, I hate when it does that, sorry, an established political movement or party, which means you had to be, you know, a fairly entrenched presence in American politics and could be held publicly accountable. You were regulated by the Federal Election Commission. You were regulated under parts of the tax code. You were, or you could buy advertising, in which case you were regulated by the Federal Election Commission and the Federal Communications Commission. You ran a media organization, in which case usually you held yourself to one of those sort of standards of neutrality, and were also regulated in various places by organizations. You had to publicly disclose your buying or spending on political advertising, depending on which side of this you were on. But all of those are things that you do to that make you accountable in the public sphere for what you say. So if you are going to engage in race baiting because you think it's good politics or because you're a racist, if you're going to reach, yes, you could say racist stuff at a bar and 12 people will hear you, and that's terrible, or on a city bus and 19 people will hear you. But if you want to reach thousands and tens of thousands or millions of people with your racism, you need to basically be some sort of public entity. And that means that what you say can be traced back to you, and other people can hold you accountable in a democratic system for what you say. And what has changed with the internet is that the barriers to entry for communicating with large numbers of people at a time on any topic, but certainly on politics, have been lowered. And for a while, we celebrated everything that meant. We talked, you know, the sort of some part of the romance of the Obama campaigns in the United States in 2008. You probably had a little vestigial version of this with the first Trudeau campaign in Canada. The romance of it was, oh, they're using the internet. They're bringing more people into the process. People are now able supporters are able to find one another without having to go through the big old party machines. This is wonderful. It's lowering the barriers to entry for political participation, and we're seeing an enlivened democracy because of it. And this was part of the global story. This was basically the dominant narrative about the Arab Spring, right? One guy in Cairo who has a Twitter feed doesn't need to have obviously doesn't have a state-run broadcast outlet, does not have a long-standing political movement, and but he could say, come on down to Tahrir Square, and people would see his post, and you could start a mass movement basically immediately. And so we celebrated lowering the barriers to entry there for civic participation. Well, it turns out that there are people whose motives aren't so noble, whose causes might not be so just, and the barriers to participation have been lowered for them as well. And so now they can reach large number of people without being accountable in the public sphere for what they say the way that you would have been in an imaginary 1980. And the people who are coming into the process, sometimes it's individuals, right, who are citizens who do have free speech rights, and what they say might be noxious or whatever, but they can now speak anonymously in a way you really couldn't to large numbers of people before. But it's also people sometimes not in this country who are doing it to make money off of our political process because of the way that internet advertising works, who are often untraceable and certainly are having an impact on our political process, but are not really fundamentally political actors. Foreign intelligence services or governments that in some form or other, people who just want to create mayhem or chaos, are now able to communicate at a scale and scope which was impossible without fundamentally, rising up as a public entity of some form a generation ago. And I think that's a real shift. So yes, the foundations of American politics have changed without the internet, but the internet has made it possible for some of the sort of malevolent forces that want to take advantage of these fundamental shifts to become participants in the political conversation in a way they could not have before.
Saren, is this a new hand, or did you want to follow up?
Yeah, I just had a follow up, just to follow up just what was just shared. So I have two questions, two-part question.
Yeah, sure.
How do you respond to people who say the internet, or are very dismissive and say the internet is not reality? So that's number one. Number two, what you cited and what was in the Obama campaign, was the result of like novelty. It sounds like you're alluding to a novelty effect. And my question is some of the things that you're citing now that they're normal, how does it, like, what do we do now from like a policy perspective, or I don't know, legal standpoint from your vantage point, to address this new normal? Because now it's normal and mainstream, right? Like you just said. So I think I just wanted to ask.
Yeah, well, sorry, what was I was thinking about what I was going to say to your first question, then I forgot what your first question was, so I could think about what I was going to say to your second question. What was your first question?
The first question again is for those people who just dismiss and say,
"Oh, it's not real life." Right.
Yeah, it's not real life, and why should I care? Right?
Yeah, so I think
somebody talks about and squawks about on the internet. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that these things are related, right? So yes, the internet is not a facsimile of real life. And a lot of what I write about in the book is about people in American politics who've applied themselves to coming up, mostly on the American left or center left, to coming up with tools and tactics to address disinformation, is figuring out how to appropriately read the internet so that they bring the proper sense of proportion and context, because the campaign is actually playing out in real life, but still a huge share of Americans are getting information and political information online, and it's not and so I think that what was the main character of this book, who this woman Jory Craig, she's has this amazing backstory. She so we're in that period in November 2016 that I mentioned, right? Everybody in certainly Democratic politics and the media is panicking about how did Trump win? What did we miss? The people who start thinking about, like, wow, there's all this stuff that happened on the internet we didn't really fully understand at the time. There was this hack of the Democratic National Committee, WikiLeaks distributed it. There were these fake Facebook web pages, like this Denver Guardian that looked like a newspaper from Denver, but was just totally fake. Who was behind that? There were all of these like weird new Facebook groups popping up that looked like they were local, community groups, but there was no actual, it wasn't clear there was an actual person. All these things popped up. We didn't understand them. And so you have these senior figures on the American left and the Democratic Party and labor unions who started, who should we talk to understand, what are, bot networks, what are trolls, all this whole vocabulary that was foreign to them. And they all find their way to this woman, Jory Craig, who at the time was like 25 years old. She was from Illinois. She was a model United Nations nerd in high school, ends up working after college for a Democratic consulting firm in Washington that by a sort of freak of history ends up having the largest overseas consulting practice of a Washington firm. And so she gets hired there right out of college as a junior digital operative. And her first job is she gets sent to Moldova to help a parliamentary leader get on Facebook for the first time. And then she goes to Gabon and Panama and the Philippines and the Bahamas. And 2016 rolls around. She's watching politics in her home country from afar. But after the election, when people in Washington are saying, who's seen anything like this? And nobody who'd run a campaign in the United States had to think about bots or trolls or any of this stuff. They all find their way to Jory Craig because a lot of the things that seem very new to us in American politics in 2016 were not actually new to politics. So foreign interference, something that countries around the world take for granted in their elections, that they're going to be foreign business or government interests that are going to spend money to try to influence policy in their country. I think we're grappling with the idea that rumor and conspiracy theory can be a significant force shaping our politics. I think if you went anywhere in the Middle East, they would say, yeah, that politics is basically like a contest of competing like rumor mobs. Ideologically motivated or partisan media, we're grappling with the seeming novelty of this. Obviously, in most parts of the world, it's not in the least bit novel. And so she had been with campaigns and parties that had to make smart judgments about how to communicate in an environment where these dynamics existed. And what she's been able to do in the last 8 years, and she's advised all of the major figures in Democratic politics during that time, and some significant forces overseas as well, is to try to translate the facts of the internet to the mindset of, and that's because she counters a lot of people who've overcorrected for basically ignoring the internet up until 2016. Basically people who had the internet is not real life. Why should I, contort my campaign to what people are saying on Twitter or Facebook? Like the old people who vote in our elections are watching TV and whatever. That was the dominant mindset among political professionals before 2016. And then after 2016, people tended to overcorrect and be like, oh my God, there's a trending topic where they, got my age wrong. We need to like drop everything and correct this because misinformation on the internet is the biggest problem in American politics. And neither of those is the right perspective. The right perspective is that there are all sorts of vectors for information. There are all sorts of reasons, and people were overreacting in part because they could not politicians could not disentangle their national security concerns about disinformation, their ego about being attacked someplace that they couldn't control or respond to, with a poor reading of the actual political dynamics, because the internet still does not have a good, it's not real life, but there's not a good one-to-one relationship between a given social platform and real life, because they all have different audiences that do not map neatly onto onto political populations because a like is not a vote. And so a lot of the data project that firms and groups have been doing that I write about in this book is trying to figure out how to understand the movement of information online to get to the core question. And this is true of a lie and of something that's true, which is this getting in front of people whose opinions are actually in play on an issue that could shift their vote choice? That's the crucial question. And the fact is, one way in which, a lot of the misinformation, disinformation that the news media overcovers now, probably, that political people are prone to overreact to, is stuff that is being created by diehards on one side or the other for the amusement of other like-minded diehards, and not actually getting in front of the small share of voters whose views are persuadable, or if they are getting in front of the people whose views are persuadable, not on issues that will move them. And the thing that Jory Craig and the people like her are doing that I write in my book is trying to help campaigns to intelligently ignore 99% of the stuff that happens online and be really smart about figuring out what is the 1% and how do you answer it in a way that doesn't make the problem worse.
So we've got about 8 more minutes. So if anyone else has any other questions, feel free to raise your hand. But one of the notable differences between the Victory Lab and the lie detectives is that Victory Lab is very much focused on a bunch of academics, and then lie detectives is very much focused on political consultants. You mentioned one of them, and also Reid Hoffman and other sort of private sector places. Do you see a role for academia, or how should academia change in response to this new focus on disinformation and what needs to be changed?
Yeah, so I think that good question. So I think there are all sorts of academic researchers who are studying disinformation, misinformation in all sorts of ways from a public opinion perspective. Folks who are trying to get closer to understanding what a sort of policy regulatory framework could be in the United States. Many of them have gotten caught up in the increasing polarization of the debate over disinformation. You guys have had a version of this too, as best I understand, in Canada. And so the people who are doing this work in academia are in many respects just as implicated in the politics of it as the people who are doing the politics of it. The core thing that I wanted to do differently in this book was I felt like there's a lot of talk about what the platforms can do or should do. There's a lot of talk about disinformation from a sort of society level perspective, democracy level perspective, civilization level perspective. I didn't really think I could add a lot to, and I think there's been some very good investigative journalism on the kind of supply side of disinformation. Some of the people who are behind it and why. I didn't think I could add a whole lot to sort of those literatures, and that I didn't know on a fast moving topic what there was to say. But the thing that really struck me as missing is this question of how political practitioners, especially in the campaign context, identify. The fact is, sort of where I left the last point, but it's like it's just a very different set of challenges than I think academics are dealing with, right? And the campaign, the folks in the campaigns, the way they're thinking about this is I think similar to the way that a lot of people in the, let me put it this way, the situation in the Victory Lab, fairly distinctive. So there are like corporate marketers who wanted to learn from both the people I wrote about in the book and from what I wrote about in the book, because Anheuser-Busch, AB InBev called me, and their like marketing team was like, we want to learn what the Obama campaign did so that we can use it to sell beer. And there are sort of limited applications for taking innovations in political micro-targeting experiments and applying them to consumer marketing. The challenges around tracking and countering disinformation, I think, are probably a lot closer for between political campaigns and other types of businesses, public figures, institutions. And the simple fact is that if you are a public figure or public-facing institution right now, people will be lying about you and or the issues you care about all the time online. Like that is the way that the internet is now. Like, and most of it you should ignore. Like you should not, and this is true if you're a political campaign, it's true if you're a college or university, or you're a company, or you're a celebrity, or you're a sports team. Like people are going to lie about you. They're going to make stuff up about you or the issues you care about. And most of it you should ignore because it's actually not affecting your vote share, your stock price, the number of admissions applications you're going to get, the number of tickets you're going to sell, like whatever your metric of success is, because it's probably not getting in front of the people who are on the cusp of buying or selling your equities or buying a season ticket package or not, on a topic that is going to change their opinions or behavior. But figuring out how to make that distinction intelligently, because on the rare occasions that they do, it can be a significant effect. That's a unique problem for participants that I don't think academics have the same. I'm not sure there's a huge public good in like figuring out what the best, the term I use on my on the cover is, a playbook for winning elections. And I'm not sure that the playbook for winning elections, that's a very particular challenge, because one of the misperceptions I think we have had is like, look, it is not the responsibility of the Joe Biden campaign or the Tory party in the UK or like whatever to fight disinformation. Like that might be a problem for governments. We might think it should be a problem for the platforms to deal with. We might think it ought to be a problem that civil society attaches itself to. Campaigns have a goal of reaching, in the United States, at least in our two-party system, 50 plus 1% of the vote on election day. And I think one of the major problems that people like Jory Krecker are trying to correct is campaigns thinking that it is their job, that they need to respond to disinformation for its own sake. No, they need to respond to disinformation if it's going to lose them a vote, directly or indirectly. And that anything that doesn't is just a distraction. And a lot of this book is about people learning how to do politics in an era with a whole new set of distractions that at the moment have the disadvantage of also being novelty. And some of the story of the years I wrote about in this book, and I think what we're going through now, is going to be people getting used to the aspects of this which were novel, right? And like, at some point 100 years ago, you went out on election day and you didn't know if it was going to rain or not. And probably your whole set of tactics for, how you were going to get people out to the polls suddenly changed when the skies opened up and it rained. And then we got weather forecasts. And guess what? Like there wasn't novelty to the rain coming down anymore, because you could anticipate it a little and make smarter decisions of we're going to give all of our canvassers umbrellas or something, right? And so some of this is getting past the novelty phase so that people can make smart decisions in the moment. And I just don't think that that's a type of question that academics are as invested in as practitioners.
Thank you very much. We are at the top of the hour, so we should be respectful of your time. But just wanted to say thank you very much for joining us, Sasha.
Thank you. It's good to be with you all, and I hope I get to see you in person sometime.
And,
really enjoy this conversation. Thank
as
you.
I mentioned, his new book is Lie Detectives, and I highly recommend it. So thank you everyone for joining us, and hope you have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.